Hello and welcome back to the Healthtech Pigeon podcast, where we break down the health tech news every single week. And I am joined today by three very special guests. And we're going to be talking about adoption in healthcare, adoption of technology and making impact. So without further ado, over to you, Heather. Why don't you say hi?
Okay, hi. Well, thank you very much for hosting this, Jessica. I'm Heather Cook. I am the MD of Ripple Scale, but perhaps more interesting for this conversation, I've spent probably 14 years in the digital health industry as an innovator. So I have led three businesses, three very impactful businesses, three evidence-based businesses, three incredible patient delivering outcome organisations that have all in their own way failed to scale beyond the pilot phase. So I have many scars, I have many learning points, and I have perhaps a very unique perspective on this adoption challenge that everybody is facing right now.
Thank you for joining us. Fiona, over to you.
Hi, thanks for having us, Jessica. My name is Fiona McCormick. I'm a speech and language therapist, and I have developed a speech and language therapy app to tackle the issues that I have faced being a speech and language therapist in the NHS. So I'm coming here to talk about my experiences with trying to get an innovation to be adopted within the NHS.
Thanks, Jess. So I'm Toby Croft. I'm have the, I think maybe great pleasure, one might say, of being a civil servant, but I'm the head of innovation for health in the Scottish Government. And I think from my perspective, I think so I've been at the intersection of industry, NHS, government policy for the last 8-9 years of my career, and I think offering that kind of system government level kind of perspective on actually how do we look at addressing that implementation gap. So really great to be here, and thanks for having me.
Pleasure. It's so unusual actually for this podcast that have the privilege of being joined by such breadth of knowledge and expertise and different vantage points. So I'm really excited to kind of get into this conversation and get your perspectives on some of these big topics, because usually it's me and one other person, and sometimes James and I will often have a domestic live on air as we debate some of these topics. So it's good to get some of the experts in. Awesome. Well, I would love to dive into our first story today. It is from the King's Fund. It's a really brilliant think piece from Pritesh Mistry, who's a fellow over there in digital technology, and he's talking about innovation, economic growth, medtech, and the NHS. And I guess that journey from strategy, and I think we're all au fait with the strategies that come out, the biblical strategies that come out from the centre around the direction of travel, the vision, and where we want to head. To then what that actually means in practice into the delivery, and then when it gets into the hands of clinicians, it gets into the hands of patients. And I think none of us are under any illusion that there is an innovation issue in the NHS in the UK, or even more globally as we think about other health systems and geographies as well. I think we are surrounded by innovation that's moving faster than most of us, certainly myself, can keep up with. But I think what we're not seeing is that translating into impact, into some really potentially impactful technologies and solutions being able to get where they need to be in order to scale and support the people that they're built for. So I guess, Heather, I'd love to come to you first. You've already today been chatting to lots of clinical entrepreneurs about their journey and their experience, really acutely in this. So what are you hearing through those conversations?
I think probably the first thing I'd like to say is that I don't think we do have an innovation problem, right? So we have an adoption problem. So we are brilliant in this country at stimulating innovation. We have SBRI, we've got Innovate UK, we have the Health Innovation Networks, we have phenomenal programs to encourage clinical entrepreneurs. Indeed, right now I've just stepped out of the Clinical Entrepreneurs Big Pitch event in London. There must be 150 exhibitors. Most are very similar to Fiona, that have been born out of a clinical background, that have been encouraged to look at challenges in the particular pathway that they work in and develop entrepreneurial solutions to overcoming issues with unmet need from a patient perspective, supporting, a new mother, helping to prevent the progression of the list goes on. So we don't have an innovation stimulation challenge. I've been here a few hours already today, and I must have had a dozen conversations already with entrepreneurs that have left their clinical day job for the day to come here and pitch their innovation. Some have already kind of developed a product that they can pilot. They've started to get evidence, and yet the same thing comes up. They reach the top of the first mountain where they've got an MVP. They have maybe piloted in a particular area. They've had huge encouragement from the funders, from the clinicians, from even perhaps some of the commissioners that they're, working under the guidance of. And yet they realise now that they have a choice to make. They can either step outside their clinical practice and become a chief exec. Honestly, having done that role for many years, it's not something I would necessarily recommend. They then have to raise investment. They have to satisfy the needs of investors if they're lucky. And then they have to run their own company. And then they have to try and find a way of breaking through the noise of thousands of other innovators trying to get a slice of a very small piece of cake to scale their products. And that's really, really unsustainable and very... it can disillusion innovators very, very quickly, knowing that they have yet another mountain to scale. And why is it difficult? Well, we could spend a whole hour on this podcast talking about that adoption problem, but think about it in terms of navigating procurement, navigating commissioning, navigating evidence requirements. How do you implement your product? How do you train staff to use a different kind of think about, integrating a digital health product into a clinical pathway? And I could go on and on and on, not to mention trying to find a sales force that will then scale that problem for you. And it's because the system isn't fit for purpose. So from a clinical entrepreneur perspective, there are thousands of individual point solutions all trying to find space to scale a small part of a pathway, but we don't aggregate these pathways together. We don't offer up to the system a women's health pathway, a CYP pathway, a rare disease pathway. We try and offer up point solutions, and that is never going to work. So I would say the buzz in the room today at the Clinical Entrepreneurs Programme is great. We are very, very good at stimulating this innovation challenge. And papers like Pritesh's in the King's Fund, absolutely summarise many of the challenges that we face as an industry. But we're kind of in an echo chamber at the moment. We're all saying the same thing, that there is an adoption problem. But identifying 3 or 4 really big hitting digital health innovations across maybe 3 or 4 clinical pathways is not going to solve the problem that we're all facing. And I'm sure Fiona and Toby have perspectives on this, so I'll just pause there. But again, today I'm hearing the same things that I've heard for many years, that I've experienced myself. So I'm really interested to see where this conversation goes in terms of how we can fix the adoption problem.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And it's especially when you're in rooms like in the Clinical Entrepreneur Programme events that they put on, you see that often the biggest and shiniest innovations are the ones that get rocketed up. And it's the innovations that maybe are looking to serve a smaller, maybe 1 million people in the population, that are kind of like left behind in that, because there isn't that much profit in it. So the bigger companies or the funders aren't going to get behind it so much. So innovators are left alone to kind of tackle that, and it's really difficult. And I mean, the King's Fund paper spoke about how much you can see that the public want innovation. So how many people are privately funding their weight loss drugs, because they want to move as quickly as the innovation is moving, but the NHS seems to be lagging behind in that. And if we want to get out in front of all of the different issues that we have in the NHS with our aging population, and how can we implement prevention, the digital approach is the only way to do that, because we don't have enough clinicians for the amount of people that we have in the country, and there are so many issues that we're not tackling because we're just reacting to all of the issues at the moment. So it's really difficult. And I mean, from my own perspective, it's been such a long journey, and facing all of those barriers, like Heather's mentioned, each time you get to the top of a mountain that you think, okay, this is it, I've built my app, surely this is the top, everyone's going to love it. Then you get there and you talk to NHS leads and they say, yeah, we do love it, but now you've got to go through your digital processes. Sorry, I've forgotten the word that I want to say there.
DTAC assessment, is that the one?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
digital assurance processes.
Ah.
Your digital assurance processes. And you think, okay, well, how am I going to do that? I don't have funding. I don't have the resources or the expertise to do that. Where am I going to get that from? And for me, I've had to pivot to kind of a different revenue stream into schools to hopefully raise enough money to then go back into the NHS to do digital assurance processes. And I've been lucky because I've been helped by the Health Innovation East, who have helped with that. But even when you get the help as an innovator and you get funding, that's great, but you're still having to wear all of these different hats, and you're trying to navigate all these different processes that you've never been through before. And obviously, you're not the best person for the job. You're a clinician. That's where your skills lie, and that's where your expertise lies. And it is a shame, like Heather said, to kind of lose that in the process of it. And I think, things that are coming out now, like Ripple Scale, where there are opportunities for innovators to get that expertise and the support and the funding, is almost going to be a life raft for a lot of innovators, like all of those at the big pitch today, who they've got great ideas, but where do you turn? No, people don't have lots of backing behind them. So it's a really complex issue, and it's a shame that we've got this issue.
Yeah, definitely. How is Ripple Scale? What's Ripple Scale doing to kind of bridge that gap and support that adoption piece?
Yeah, it is so logical how we're approaching this. So when I started to really think about the adoption challenge, and in discussion with colleagues around the system and Cognis, where a lot of these apps are built, the infrastructure, we started to look at different models that exist in different industry sectors, and we fell upon a publishing model. So if you are an author, be that an academic author or a kind of fiction author, and you write a book, you don't then go and build a printing press in your back garden. You don't then go and buy paper to print your book. You don't then manufacture your book. You don't then go and fill your suitcase with your book and take your suitcase around every Waterstones or every academic, department in the country. You work with a publisher. So we applied that same model to the theory of how to innovate and adopt digital health problems for health systems. And it resonated and landed really well. So the subject matter experts, the clinicians or the small innovators are still able to concentrate on building exceptional digital health products without the need for very heavily funded VC investment on a common platform like Cognis, who have a no-code app development platform where apps can be built in a matter of weeks or months rather than 5 years. I was speaking to a lady this morning who spent 5 years developing a very relatively simple app that I know that could be built within probably 2 months on a no-code platform. So Ripple Scale will take these apps, maybe 100 apps in a women's health pathway. We'll curate them. We'll ensure that the common infrastructure that they're built on complies with DTAC, with clinical assurance, with DPIA, with clinical safety. We'll assure the whole pathway. We'll ensure that evidence has been generated. We will ensure that outcomes can be monitored in a very single and simple and cohesive way. We'll package those up And working with the system who have signalled this unmet need, we will then curate and sell effectively an entire clinical pathway to a commissioner rather than 100, 200, 1,000 point solutions. And that overcomes so many challenges. I mean, back to the King's Fund paper, which I think is brilliant. But at the moment, it's pointing to a solution where only one solution will be identified for a particular challenge. So there might only be one pelvic health. There might be one speech and language therapy solution. Now, if you take the British National Formulary, we don't just have one treatment for cancer. We don't just have one treatment for endometriosis. We have a variety. We allow patients and clinicians to choose. And what one patient responds better to might not be the same as, a similar patient in a similar kind of category of need. So we're able to offer more choice. So the commissioner would buy an entire pathway of digital health solutions, and many of them, perhaps the majority in the first place, will be these smaller point solutions, which when aggregated together offer an entire pathway of care. From a procurement perspective, you will commission once rather than manage a relationship with 100, 250, 300 suppliers. The publisher will then manage the relationship between the innovator, manage the relationship with the commissioner, and everything becomes so much simpler. It will encourage clinicians like Fiona to stay in clinical practice and not worry about recruiting a business development team, not worry about ensuring your product remains DPIA, DTAC compliant. That's the job that the publisher does. So the model works really well in academic book publishing, in regular publishing. So we believe that this model should work in digital health. And so far, and it'd be interesting to hear Toby's views on this. So far, the system that we have started to engage with, and again, we are not going to design this framework and this structure ourselves. We want to co-produce the solution to this kind of ubiquitously problematic adoption gap with the system. So that's kind of what Ripple Scale is going to do. And the early signs so far, we're a few months into this journey, have been incredibly promising, that it gives the innovators, such as those at the Clinical Entrepreneur Programme, a route to scaling and commercialising, because we will then pay a royalty to the entrepreneur, not expect the entrepreneur to go and build a company, become a chief exec and manage all the commercials.
Nice. Well, talking of the system, I want to come to the system, Toby. Not to put you on the spot, but
not sure I like being described as the system myself. There we go.
Capitalising on the opportunity to really ask you some questions, to be honest, because I'm keen to understand from your perspective. I think we're always really. It's very easy for us to attribute the problem with the system. And I think clearly there are, I mean the system at large, not you, the system.
Won't take it personally, Jen.
There are, of course, those issues, but it strikes me that these tensions and these frustrations are felt within the system, within, the NHS organisations, be that more central government organisations, or indeed, healthcare providing organisations like trusts and ICBs and other primary care organisations and everything in between. So I'm keen to kind of get your perspective here on where some of those frustrations are from your side of things, but where you're also seeing the opportunity with something like Ripple Scale, where you have one trusted place that you can go to then be able to identify solutions that are going to have impact at scale.
So I think between what Heather and Fiona have both said throughout this, there are a lot of areas where I was thinking that's an area to pick up on, that's an area to pick up on. I think one thing I did kind of think, one of the things that I think Heather first raised is, and this actually, sorry to jump the gun a bit, it comes to your second King's Fund article as well, but it's actually about layering technology on top of broken pathways. And I think what we have at the moment, and I think from a policy perspective, and just to say, I've worked in UK government, I've worked in devolved administrations, and I've worked across kind of UK health systems in my time. And I think just part of what I see quite consistently is maybe from a central level, and not to lay blame on my colleagues in the civil service, but maybe like a lack of baselining firstly. So if you're looking to address a clinical pathway or an issue, actually, what is that pathway? What does it look like? And what do you want the outcome to be? And I think there's a mismatch necessarily between so strategy and policy on the government side, and then the implementation delivery aspect from an NHS side, and often talking in ways a different language, but trying to achieve the same purpose. And it's a point of how do we start speaking the same language? I have the same conversation about, well, actually, from a health perspective, how do you start talking the same language as people? And from an economic perspective, enterprise agencies and things where you're talking about foreign direct investment and things, because people don't understand it. People don't care about health economic analysis. If you're just, working on the economic side, they're like, well, where's the business outcomes? Now, I've gone a bit off piece there, but what I was going to say really was more around policy itself can set the drivers and the deliveries, and it's about creating that enabling environment and creating at least the criteria for success. I think the key thing is that often we start talking about what the benefits of innovation will be. It's always, we know the why, we know what the benefits are, but the how is different no matter where you go. In the NHS England 10-year plan, the talk about innovation is on the kind of big bets area and technology areas, not necessarily the how are we going to do this. It's that this is what we're going to explore. There are mechanisms for how to implement in terms of maybe the 3% ring fencing of a budget in NHS England trusts, but again, that how they do it is at the discretion of board, like the trust chief execs. And sorry, I'm going to flip between saying board and trust, because in Scotland it's not a trust, it's a board. So apologies if I do flip between that. And the same counts across all of the NHS organisations across the UK. Chief execs have a lot of power. Even if you implement the technology, they can pull that if they want to. There's nothing stopping them from doing it. Whereas, say, if you look at medicines, that they can't unless it's no longer a recommended product. And so when it comes to digital, when it comes to diagnostics, there are, I think, lots of small issues that exist that are around the powers that exist for individuals, that actually inhibit almost the operating environment and the environment by which you can succeed. I would also say then when it comes to that procurement aspect, so I think it's really key where you have an organization. So Ripple Scale is a really interesting organization to me, because what you're seeing is an organization being set up that is being crowdfunded, that is publicly owned in that way, and that provides a certain level of assurance, i.e. it's going to meet all these standards, it is going to get your product to this specification. Whereas actually what we've seen before, say with, you see the AI marketplaces coming in, it doesn't necessarily meet all those standards. It may, and maybe just the product a company itself recommends from their own suite. Whereas this provides an actual way for which either clinical staff, non-clinical staff, patient groups, etc., I should say, well, we want to see this. We want to be able to access it. How do we do it? And I think having that kind of route by which a big system kind of provider, be that one big public procurer or an ICB or a trust specifically, and giving them that route to say, well, this is a library of things that are accessible to your patients, that's really beneficial. But when it comes down to it, I think government then and policy has a role in saying, well, what are the standards by which we want to see that happen? So how do we want you to make that accessible to patients, so that we're making sure that they're getting access to things that are right for them? What's patient access versus what's clinician access? How does that interface? And I think those are the things we need to start solving in a bit more detail. I'd also just like to quickly say, even Jess, I think you mentioned the NHS app and functionality there, that's not even across the UK. Scotland is going to be launching its own app in early this summer, and even then, that's the start of it. And that's meant to be across health and social care. But obviously, it's a point of that's a big ask for the start of a product already. And so what it risks is, and this isn't an official position when I say this, is just a risk position of what risks complete, I think, just oh god, I've forgotten the term, scope creep, that's the word. Risk complete scope creep, to say, well, how do we get involved in this, and then risk getting mired in non-delivery. And I think that's a really big risk as well. So I think when we look at innovation, when we look at providers like Ripple, I think it provides one of the biggest gaps we see, which is at least a bit of digital infrastructure that enables interoperability rather than multiple providers having to, and the onus being on single suppliers to do all the interoperability themselves, suppliers to work with one another, and actually provides a really clear route for that across not just areas where venture capital providers want to do it. So I think it's a really good opportunity, and from a government perspective, I think really does break down some of those barriers that we often face as well.
Because the alternative, if I could just come in there briefly, is we choose the easiest solution, which is to ask one of the big suppliers that are already incumbent, can you build me one of these? Because it's already interoperable. And that is a major risk, I think, to UK PLC, to the innovators that I'm with today at the event, and to the health system, because we shouldn't be just asking a major supplier that perhaps isn't even domiciled in the UK to build, point solutions just because the infrastructure makes it easier to do that. So there has to be a different way. There's not just the patient costs of not getting this right. There's the kind of economic growth costs. There's the costs that we see. So, we're great at investing in early stage startups, but what happens to the majority of startups in this health tech space that look promising? They take their product elsewhere, usually, over the pond, and because we don't make it easy. And we don't make it easy because evaluation is so important to justify that kind of cost benefit analysis. And how do you evaluate thousands of different apps that are built on thousands of different tech stacks that all kind of monitoring it? So the system also has a role to play to make sure that standards are defined and outcomes that need to be demonstrated are communicated, and that innovation can kind of report and deliver. Sorry, someone's just very noisy now. Someone's just come into my room. And outcomes can be aggregated and presented back across a whole clinical pathway. We don't make it easy, but I think there is a way through this. But we have to work as a system. We have to work as an alliance, as a team, to define how to mend the broken bridge that we are currently wobbling on all of the time.
And you mentioned the problem with adoption, and it feels like, of course the conversation has to start at the top level, but for things to really be adopted properly, it needs clinician backing and clinician buy-in. And it feels like, there is a little bit of fear in the NHS around innovation. Most healthcare professionals prefer to be fast followers to new tech than to early adopters, which is in one of your articles, Jessica. And it really struck me, absolutely, like being around other clinicians. Innovation, it is kind of scary, and people are very skeptical of it, and that will limit how much success any innovation has.
I guess to build on that a little bit, but also to come to that second article, which is very much about I guess the consumer forces that are at play here. I'm keen to understand, you talk there about how clinicians can sometimes be very wary and have reservations, and rightly so, because that's how they're trained. But you mentioned earlier about I guess the GLP-1 space at the moment, and how actually a lot of people have given up on the NHS altogether and circumnavigated and gone private, and we even see in really extreme situations people purchasing off the black market. On TikTok, I even see content that comes up that's positioned as Boots, and you click on it and it's not Boots at all. It's a completely just rogue like shop front to just be able to buy weight loss medication that is not even approved in the UK or in the US. And friends who have been like, oh, do you think I should take this? And I'm like, no, stop. But it just goes to show, I think, that the forces are changing, and I think consumer forces are creating more pressure in a positive way, for the most part, on the health system in order to adopt these things. And so I guess my question is, how are we seeing that kind of play out from an NHS perspective? Because I think we're relatively, we can see firsthand, what this means GLP-1s is a perfect example of that, point of care testing. That's becoming all the more common, and people not thinking too hard about whether to use something like that. But how and where do you think that pressure is being applied, and what do you think the impact of that is?
So there are two kind of aspects here. And I think one of them is that, it's that shift of the traditional seller push per se, i.e. what we used to see with pharma companies pushing and still do, you push a product on the provider you want to sell to them. And that narrative has shifted a bit more to co-design, co-develop, and co-create, which is really good to see. But what that's shifted to now is actually consumers saying, well, we want this, we want all this, because obviously what you have is direct consumer advertising, constantly more solutions being set up around, GLP-1s, again, really good example, loads of private providers that are offering the wraparound services. That is, nice recommended in terms of early value assessment ones, sure. You see a lot that aren't on that, and a lot that are just, private providers that may have done, say, hair loss treatments and things like that before, and they might not necessarily meet the same criteria. I think it's a point here where it's how do we navigate that is a really key thing. So that direct consumer thing, and it's that not just the NHS, but government and public health providers, etc., actually actively taking that role to say, how do we speak to the consumer, not just the public? Because that's a very different message. You can put public messaging out there, but actually it's changing a mindset to these are consumers of your product. Your product is healthcare. How does that change? What does that mean? And I think it's another, that second point I was going to say is how do you articulate what the system needs? Now, we've seen it with NHS England in terms of demand signaling, and that has, worked to a degree with bigger pharma players. So great, we understand the need, we understand what you're looking for, so let's have a conversation. But what that doesn't do is actually look at then, so ground up innovation. So Fiona, your sort of product is a really good example where you see a need, clinicians see a need, and you're not trying to, go in with a product and say, oh, who's interested in this? You're actually developing it from the ground up. And that is the biggest thing that is often lost in the system, is those ground up service made and led developments. And I think regardless of anything, part of the biggest issue around innovation adoption or adoption of any tech is getting people interested, getting them understanding and getting them trusting that. And the biggest issue is often because it's people bringing new things in rather than actually saying this has been developed by someone working in the system, what we do. And that's that big trust point, which is key. And I think things that governments get wrong so often is just putting it in from the top down, and that doesn't work.
Completely agree. I mean, what happens now, as a consumer of healthcare myself, I don't just have one need. I need to navigate my own health. I might need to navigate my children's health. I've got elderly parents. I need to help navigate their health. And in the absence of viable, accessible digital health solutions, the only place I wouldn't do this because I'm in the industry, but the only place that an average consumer can go to is the Wild West of the App Store and take a punt and hope that the shiny looking kind of digital health app that might cost, £29.99 a year or 99p or £199 is going to meet my needs in a safe and ethical way. But I have to find one for dementia. I have to find one for my MSK challenges. I have to, as a worried parent, I might have to find one for neurodiversity. And so in reality, I'm not going to do any of those things. So the potential of digital health is not being realised, or if it is being realised, it's being realised in a very unsafe way, because there is no simple way for me to access trusted and assured, funded by my NHS provider, healthcare. And I resort to finding that rogue GLP-1 supplier that maybe is selling me a drug that's still in a trial phase because it's kind of somehow managed to, say that it's from Boots, which clearly it's not. And because the average healthcare patient is not as well versed in safety, security, sovereignty of data as we are all on this call and those that listen to this podcast. So what do we do? Does the system make it easier for patients to access phenomenal aggregates of digital health solutions, or don't they? And it's another real call to action that the alternative, with the importance of social media and paid for marketing, is running away. I was speaking to a friend of mine at the weekend whose child has just been diagnosed with ADHD. And she said, I found this great app on the App Store because my doctor wasn't able to offer me anything. And she showed me what it was. And I'm thinking, oh, my goodness, maybe this is okay, but I have no idea where this data is going. I have no idea whether actually the clinical advice that is being shared with this newly diagnosed patient is correct. Now, this particular app might be okay. It might be DTAC compliant. It might have a clinical safety officer behind it, or it might be, developed by a chatbot. And is charging. She was delighted it was only $2.99 a month, and I'm thinking, no, it cannot be the right way. So looking at the future of digital health, we have got to somehow make the access to digital health solutions integratable into a patient healthcare record. Ultimately, this has to be prescribed through an NHS app. It has to be, monitored against your patient healthcare record. And how can we do that unless we have kind of a really clear, sensible, demand signaled, evidence-based process for accessing digital health solutions? And I'm not talking about I'd like to say, blockbuster digital health solutions, the ones that should probably have a national contract. I'm talking about the locally designed that meets the needs of neighbourhoods, with users at the heart, with clinicians that have seen firsthand the challenges. Right now, there is just no way of scaling those beyond the initial kind of pilot area. So that's what I really hope that Ripple Scale will be able to do, to break through some of these really complicated, but actually I think quite simple to solve, intractable challenges that are preventing phenomenal innovation from finding their way into the hands of not only patients but clinicians that need the product so much.
I think also it's a point of what is digital health infrastructure versus what is a digital health product. And actually it's the point of, we also need to make sure that the infrastructure to support these new things and kind of do that is really in place, and that's a big gap at the moment. And so I think when you talked about those blockbusters, that's the blockbuster, that's the digital infrastructure that wouldn't be your SME, your clinical thing, but you would need big tech companies to come in and do that. But it's the actual, as you said, your last point, it's that kind of, how do you address the needs of the local person, the people in your community? That hits home in every single innovation public health strategy. No matter what you talk about, it's always about how do you make it patient or population or person centric, and enable greater level of care. And that's the key thing.
And I was also, thinking, in the age now of AI, everyone has access to a GP on their phone, or so they think. So people are going into the GP and asking for these things that aren't available, for rightly or wrongly. Some of the things that are recommended probably not appropriate, but because patients have access to what is available out there, it leads to that desperation, and that desperation then leads to people buying things off TikTok. And I guess as well, it's like comes to the point of, although innovation can be risky, going back to the point we made earlier about clinicians being concerned about it, what's sometimes the bigger risk is not acting and not getting this infrastructure in place so that we can bring in these smaller innovations to answer the problems that the people are facing and that people want support with.
And I think, we've talked about the NHS app, but ultimately that is what that is, isn't it? It's positioned as that kind of front door to someone's health and someone's experience of their healthcare. And in the article from Pritesh talking about, I guess, the consumerization of healthcare, the NHS app is positioned as the NHS's answer to that, and yet it's still not working in the way that I think we expect it to work. Everyone's experience is so different. I spoke the other day about a friend who was a GP had made a video that they posted on social media about, here's how to book your GP appointment online. I thought, brilliant, I need to book my smear test. I'm going to follow this step by step. And I open my app and my dashboard looks totally different. And I don't have an option to book an appointment. And so then I still have to go, and between the hours of whatever it is, 8 o'clock in the morning and 5, I need to fill in the form online. And I need to say there's not really anything wrong with me, but I need a smear test. Please, can you book it for me? To then be approved, to then receive an appointment. Whereas, I can go to TikTok and in the click of a button, I can buy a weight loss medication. And I think it's that kind of dichotomy that, I don't necessarily think we're going to be able to match those standards in terms of that instant access. But in terms of reducing friction, I don't think that we're there yet with the NHS app. And I think also maybe consumers at large don't necessarily understand that the app is not ubiquitous. It is not one thing, one system, one platform that everyone experiences in the same way. And that, the way lots of people in my family think about it is that I can just go on and I can maybe, hopefully just access all of my healthcare records. So that's not the reality. We know that, but that feels like a pretty fundamental thing for us to be able to navigate a care journey. But we don't even have access to the fundamentals of that. And so it feels like a really big ask to actually expect it to be that front door right now. And that we've got, I guess, a long way to go. But I think, Toby, you talked about, obviously, in Scotland, a slightly different approach. And there's a new app rolling out that really interestingly joins up the health and social care piece, which sounds fantastic. I'd love to hear how you're thinking about that over there, given that, it's slightly newer to the table.
Sure. So I think one thing I'll say just before all of that is the NHS app is, and this is a plug for my colleagues down south, but the NHS app is available in, I think it's 80% of the population's pocket that has that in their pocket. That is huge by comparison to not having an app, firstly.
Yeah.
And it has broken down some of those barriers already. I do agree with you. I think with any public system or public app, even if you look at the HMRC app, etc., can you do everything with the HMRC app? Probably not. Does it work in the way you want it to? Probably not. And I've seen numerous government apps that are clunky. But I still think it's a really good step ahead. And when you look at, I think, the trajectory that they're going on in terms of preventative services that are being offered, that's a really positive way forward. Now, is it where we need it to be now, or is it where we want it to be? No, but I think that is also just maybe a commentary on the state of consumerism in this day and age. But I'm not going to get into that and put my, let's examine neolibertarianism, etc. for this podcast.
That's another episode.
That's another episode and another fact entirely. But I think, so it is a good thing. I think where we are in Scotland, so the difference in Scotland comparatively to, say, England is that, so whilst in England you have your NHS number, Scotland you're born, you're given, and I'm not from Scotland, if people can't tell from the accent, even though I know if you're in Edinburgh, you get people who sound like me, but I'm not even from the UK originally. So I didn't have this, and so I came to it, but everyone has a CHI number, so CHI, and that is given to you at birth and is meant to follow you throughout the healthcare system, through health, social care, etc., follows you. Now, practically then that means you'd think an app being able to do that, have access to that, and your care record would be relatively simple. You'd be able to see these records, quickly, but that's not the case. We've had to take a kind of agile approach to doing it, and so it's, well, what services can you access now? How can you make those available? And so I think the first point was getting lab test results for a certain condition was one of the first things. But there is then how do you book GP services? How do you book preventative tests, etc.? Those are still things that need to be wrangled with. And then there's the whole social care conversation, power of attorney, all these sorts of things. If you have a child with special needs that requires volunteers to come pick them up, do they have access? There's loads of questions to be asked there. And so I think whilst it's a good thing to look at that kind of continuum of care and how this app can do that, but I think from that actual practical approach of how do we tackle this, especially, I think we've all seen the stereotypes of civil servants. You get a problem and you go, oh my God, there's so many problems with this, and you identify all the issues, and it almost becomes decision paralysis. And I am prone to that. I know it very well and intimately. But I think that key point is, we want to be able to ensure that it follows you across that continuum of care. We want to design this in an iterative way, and so it is meeting the expectation of the patients, that we're able to use this in terms of our preventative kind of agenda through our population health framework. And the whole approach in Scotland is meant to be a kind of digital first, people first, prevention first approach. Now that is no different from anywhere else in Western Europe. It's in line with kind of how the WHO sets us out to maybe tackle these things. But again, it comes down to the how is it going to do that? What we have is strategy that has principles, process, what have you, but it doesn't say how we're going to actually do it, where the funding is going to come from, and also how is that going to redesign the healthcare services. I think what we see, the NHS app is a good example where it's not saying, okay, great, we're going to redesign these services, and so that means we're going to invest here, but actually what does that mean we're going to disinvest from? If this fundamentally redesigns a clinical pathway, what do we not invest in future? And I will just say the last point is that's a really key thing in terms of government. Well, government budgets are under so much pressure. And what we see a lot of the time is with digital health solutions, it's like productivity savings, waiting time reductions, and there's going to be a kind of OPEX cost reduction down the line. Now, that doesn't change capital budgets allocated to the NHS. It doesn't change capital flows of where they're allocated. And what we actually need to start thinking about is when we're implementing digital solutions or anything else, what does it fundamentally change? And what does that mean we don't invest in future once that change is implemented and running as effectively as it needs to be?
My call to action then for you, Toby, is to, and I know you do this anyway, but it's to work with and collaborate with the suppliers, the community, to shape the solution to those asks from the get-go. And I think so, quite shamelessly now with Ripple Scale. So 2 things we're doing. So no, one is we will not design this in isolation. We want to engage with the system, and we are engaging. We've had very, very positive engagement so far, wanting to work with us to help design out all of these kind of challenges so we don't get decision paralysis. The second thing, I think you mentioned that we're crowdsource funding this, so we want this to be absolutely citizen owned. And many of the challenges I think that we've touched on is about trust of clinicians and trust of patients. And by having an organisation that is citizen owned, everybody kind of has a stake then in the future success of this new operating model that, by the way, is not just applicable here across the 4 nations of the UK. It's a worldwide kind of challenge. We're not the only 4 nations that are struggling with this adoption challenge. And I think the co-production piece, as we continue to develop out and solve some of these intractable or seemingly intractable challenges, has got to be done in consort with all of the stakeholders. Procurement is going to be a really important stakeholder. So how do you procure these pathways? Because right now, G Cloud is not fit for purpose for this. So how do we design into the procurement frameworks this new way of adopting and scaling digital health solutions? How do you work with finances? What expectations are there in terms of evidence generation for individual products when aggregated across a pathway, that they're delivering not only the clinical impact but the economic impact as well? How do we work with the system to demand signal where the most unmet need is? Some areas of kind of healthcare are so underinvested in terms of digital solutions. I mean, I'll take frailty, for example, and that does span health and social care. It's a great example of how, I hope that neighbourhoods and more local commissioning will seek to address some of the intractable challenges we're seeing with, demand and underfunding in the social care sector. So there's lots of kind of really exciting opportunities, I think, for transforming how we start seeing, apps like, the speech and language therapy app that Fiona's developed, get into the hand with this. This cannot be, I do not want to retire and still be in a situation where I cannot access some of the amazing innovation that I see all around me, that I've been part of growing for the last 14 years. I don't want to retire and, become frail myself, not having access to these incredibly impactful solutions. So the time is now, and the echo chamber I think that we are in, where every organization is kind of talking about the same thing. I think I'm very active in Tech UK, so I hear all the time the challenge, innovators that are going to the wall, week after week because of crazy decisions by G Cloud, because of lack of scale up opportunities, because of lack of investment. VCs now in this market will rarely invest in point solutions because they are yet to see a single credible example of a point solution that has made it. So I think the movement, I like to think of Ripple Scale rather than a company as a movement. This needs to be a movement where all parties are joined in the same direction of travel that can co-create this solution. So I think it's a really great time, because if in 12 months' time we're still talking about the adoption problem, and the only success is by identifying 3 companies that have been managed to scale nationally, then we really have failed. So, yeah.
In response to your challenge, I fully accept it. And, I think there is a real role for government and the NHS, the independent sector, charities, all, and the public, all to really work together. But it's from a government perspective, it's how do we create the conditions for that to happen? And that's what we really need to focus on at all levels of policy, not just in health generally. And I would also just say, the way I've kind of thought about Ripple Scale is like how Spotify was to music streaming, rather than downloading illegally on LimeWire and getting viruses. Actually, there's a route, or going out and buying your CDs. It was actually a way in which it allowed you to access things really readily and completely disrupted the industry, the payment models and everything. And I see this as a really beneficial thing for a sector that is so hard to get venture capital funding in, that requires oftentimes real specialist knowledge from a venture capital player as well. And often then a company to go and sell to the US or sell to the Middle East ahead of even getting a start in the NHS here, I think is a really positive step. And that is just from a looking at the industry perspective as well as a government perspective, I think is a really positive thing to see.
And will help people like, the wonderful Fiona not have to leave her clinical post, be able to continue to focus on creating brilliant content that is user-centric, that is patient designed, still do your day job, but also still be rewarded for the contribution that you're prepared to give, to step out of, I'm assuming you do most of this in your spare time, weekends and evenings. I'm assuming you want a life as well, Fiona, and you don't really want to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The great thing about it is, from every angle, Ripple Scale is a positive for whoever is engaging with it, whether it's, the NHS trust themselves, the user, the clinician, the innovator. It's a win-win for everyone. So hopefully that it can, I'm sure it can.
And I think just the way that Fiona and our other, we have, there are 60 innovations already built on a no-code platform called Cognis. There are 60 more in development. It just makes it easier then for the system to lift and shift on a common infrastructure, without having to interoperate with 1,020 different, solutions. So, absolutely, Fiona. Please don't leave your profession. Continue to do the amazing things that you do, and and trust an alternative way of scaling to an organisation that will be, the pure remit is going to be to get you published. I love the Spotify example, Toby. I'm going to steal that, if that's okay.
You're welcome.
Use that. I'm going to use that myself. It's
good.
It's a real crossover, because we actually had the founder, the co-founder of Neko Health, who co-founded Neko Health with Daniel Ek, and he used that analogy in the context of healthcare as well, which is that healthcare is ripe for disruption in a really positive way. Because you were all downloading your music on LimeWire illegally, and you were prepared to
not everyone
no
most of us. We're all wink nudging here. But it is a very good analogy, and I think having trusted platforms that clinicians, patients, systems can engage with, without it feeling completely and utterly overwhelming and not knowing which way to turn next and how to critically appraise whatever they're engaging with, I think will be so welcomed. But I really feel like we have put digital health adoption to rights in this discussion. We've covered a lot of ground. It's been really, really good. But I would love to just leave off by asking you all one thing you're working on, and where our listeners can reach you if they want to find out more about what you're doing and how they can get involved. So Fiona, why don't you go first?
So one thing I'm working on at the moment is continuing to develop and publish my speech and language therapy app, which supports children and their families to access speech therapy when they're on waiting lists, and also to implement consistently and confidently speech and language therapy activities between speech and language therapy appointments.
Well, in case listeners haven't figured it out already, I'm working on developing a completely new and revolutionary way to accelerate the adoption of digital health products. So right now, I'm crowdsource funding. So that's my biggest focus right now. So we want people to take a really close look at what we're trying to achieve here. And more information will be found on ripplescale.org, which is our website. We want people to get involved. From a funding perspective, we also want people to get involved in the Independent Digital Health Publishing Alliance as well. So if you are listening to this and you are a commissioner, a procurement person, a clinician, an innovator, and want to have your say in how this new industry is going to be shaped, then again, please get in touch. And my email is heather@ripplescale.org. And you can find me on LinkedIn. If you just search for Heather and Ripplescale, you'll find me. So I'd love to hear from people that want to help me turn this into reality. And this time next year, we want our first kind of publishing pathways of care to be available, certainly in some pilot sites, which hopefully Toby's going to help me find.
It's the aim.
No pressure, no pressure. All right, Toby, how about you?
So I mean, Heather's already nicely teed me up on one thing I'm working on, but I'll go for another one so it's not so easy. So the biggest thing I'm kind of working on at the moment is how do we in Scotland at least set the standards and framework for how we kind of bring innovation into the system and actually transform healthcare, not just kind of put new innovations in that maybe haven't been implemented for the last 5-6 years or longer. And that's kind of my biggest thing at the moment. So yeah, no pressure at all.
I would say that is quite a big thing.
Yeah, don't know how it's going to work in practice, but that's what I'm trying to do. And I won't give folks my email to get me on because I think Heather has first-hand experience of how terrible I am at emails. But I will say I am on LinkedIn and people can search me on there, and I will get back in touch if people are interested at all. I'll also do a shameless plug of if people are wanting to actually look at doing kind of real world evaluation or evidence generation or looking to safely and securely access kind of data with the NHS in partnership. NHS Scotland Innovation Hub, similar to the Health Innovation Networks in England, but all of them are directly integrated into the NHS and teams within the NHS. So you can they will facilitate that secure access to data, for example, through our Safe Haven network and things. So really just want to give them a shout out because they're a fantastic group of people and fantastic resource that really don't get enough time of day and enough light shed on them. So yeah, there we go.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for giving up your time to chat to me today. It's been such a good conversation, and I look forward to hearing what unfolds over the next 12 months and all the brilliant successes of all those things that you're working on.
Thanks very much, Jessica. Brilliant. Really great to contribute. Good hosting. Thank you.
Yes, very good.